Hi, Discovery class. Patrice Runner was a Canadian. He was 11 years old in 1976, living in Montreal with his mother. She was a single mom, living on welfare. His father had left his mother 2 years before. Child support was poor. Thoughts of a career for Patrice were a long ways off. But he says he remembers feeling that all he wanted in life was to get rich, so that he wouldn't struggle like his mother had to struggle. He told his friend, "I know a simple way to become a millionaire." His friend said to him, "How?" He said, "Well, all you have to do is find a way to make $1, and then you learn to repeat it 1,000,000 times." At the age of 19, Runner began a mail order business, and he told his readers that he was a very famous psychic. It became the greatest scam in Canadian history. Before he was caught, he had swindled victims out of $200 million. He advertised the alluring promise of great riches and a person's future completely foretold. Self-help ads vowed to share his secret, and you didn't need an education, you didn't need luck, you didn't need any talent, you didn't have to have any experience to have a fabulous wealth. All you needed was his little booklet. Send me $10 for a mail order copy of A Lazy Man's Way of How to Get Rich. Well, he promised that you'll become the wisest man that I ever knew. That's what he bragged. What was his secret? He told his readers that people are too busy earning a living to make any money. What do you require? All you have to do is believe in me. That's what he said. Just trust me. Believe in me. He immediately sold nearly 3 million copies, and he published his lies, which were nothing but promised sweeping changes and promised improvements to your life. His business exploded. He advertised himself as the world-famous fortune teller who had 40 years of accurate and verifiable predictions. He promoted the power of luck and the power of money. Send me $50 by check or money order, and I'll send you my guide to a brand new life, including winning lottery numbers. Well, more than 1 million people in Canada and the United States, they were captivated by what he said. And his fortune grew until the year 2020, when he was arrested hiding over in Spain. They brought him back to North America. He was tried in New York, and he was convicted on 18 counts of wire fraud and conspiracy for money laundering. He now resides in a detention home in Brooklyn. I get a fraud call, I think, every second day on my phone. And you probably do too. From people like Patrice Runner. And they're out to get you. Why are we so gullible? Have you ever asked yourself that? Do we want shortcuts? Do we want to get rich quick? Is it the fear of the unknown? Are we so busy earning a living to know how to make any money? That brings me to today's lesson. There's a sucker born every day. Come to think about it, we're all kind of like that. Who of us hasn't been taken in? Have you ever heard of the name Bernie Madoff? He lived in New York. He was a Jewish man. He'll go down in history, I suppose, as the world's biggest rip-off marketeer. He took all his friends for a ride on his Ponzi scheme, and he stole over $1 billion. He makes this Canadian, Patrice Runner, look like a choir boy. Well, today we're going to learn something out of life that I think is going to help us. Because if we fall prey to these frauds, we need something to keep our feet on the ground. And we need something to carry our behavior all the way through to the finish line. We've been studying the life of David in the Old Testament for our discovery class. Our text today is 1 Samuel 16, beginning at verse 1. God is addressing Samuel, who's the prophet. He's also a judge. Here's what he says. So, how long, Samuel, are you going to mope over Saul? You know that I've rejected him as my king over Israel. Fill your flask with anointing oil, and I want you to get going. I'm going to send you to Jesse, the sheep farmer over there in Bethlehem. I spotted the very king that I want, and I found him among his sons. Take a heifer with you and announce that I've come to lead you in worship to God. And with this heifer, I want you to use it as a sacrifice. When Samuel heard that, I wonder what went through his head. What's God up to anyway? Have you ever looked at your world out there and wondered the same thing? What's God up to? Has he not been looking after things very well? I'm not sure he's doing a very good job from where I'm sitting. Samuel the prophet in the Hebrew Bible has been told by God that the people's choice king, being Saul, had to be replaced. He was unqualified now for the job. Samuel's not a psychic. He's not a fortune teller. He doesn't boast that he has any inside information that's going to fool his listeners or win over his favor. In 1 Samuel 15, verse 28, Samuel tells King Saul that the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from him, and he's given it to somebody better. That somebody better is Samuel's job to find. Who's it going to be? Samuel has a problem. Where does he look for a replacement? The people elected King Saul as their king, but he's no longer qualified. What's he going to do? Israel is surrounded by enemies. Who's going to lead them and who's going to protect them? Have you ever been backed in the corner? The enemies are all around you? Well, you have to make choices when that happens. You have to protect yourself. The only one that has an answer for that is God himself, not psychics. Is God qualified to work behind the scenes? Does he know your ends from your beginnings? He put the stars in place. He made the sun come up this morning. He had you in mind when you were born. Do you know what faith is? Faith is the opposite of a psychic. Faith is that when you don't know tomorrow, God does. He holds the tomorrows in his hands, the Bible says. And when we ask him, he shows us. We don't know, but he does. Isaiah had that figured out in his book, chapter 65, verse 2. Before they call, I will answer. And while they are yet speaking, I will hear. God always knows what he's going to do, even when we don't. Patrice runners in life, they think they know, and people follow them and they're suckers. Bernie Madoff, that's a good name for him because he made off with millions. And they followed him. But it was nothing but a batch of lies. God speaks to Samuel with the notion that he's going to replace Saul. And Samuel rather, is going to play a key role in whom the Lord picks. He told Samuel to fill his ram's horn with oil, bring a young heifer to sacrifice, and go to the village of Bethlehem in the hill country of Judea. God said, I have selected a new king for myself. Go, and I will send you to Jesse. Among his sons, I will make my choice. I wonder what Samuel thought when he received that information. This is the first that Samuel has ever heard, that the Lord has already got his eyes on the one that he's going to choose. God gets fussy, doesn't he? The people chose the first king, who was a complete dud. I'm going to choose the next one, says God, and I'm picking somebody for myself. It's me whom he is going to serve. When the prophet showed up in those days on your doorstep in ancient times, it was a big deal. Teachers, it's like an inspector showing up in your classroom unannounced. Everything in the village is going to shut down when the prophet appears. The only way I could explain it to you would be like you living out in Alberta, maybe in the little town of Carbon, and suddenly the premier of Alberta shows up, unannounced and unexpected. Well, in Bethlehem, when Samuel arrived, all the shops closed. Probably the blacksmith dismissed his clients. Synagogue doors closed. Children were cleared off the street. Mothers with buggies, they lined the walkway. The prophet is coming. Everybody whispered. How could our little hamlet be so fortunate, they thought. I wonder what he wants. You know, living in the towns all over Palestine at that time were migrants from other nations. They had come and settled in among the Jews. But when they came in, they also brought their religion. And they were all idolaters, followers of Moloch, followers of god Ashtaroth. Many of them were child sacrificers. And they weren't followers of Yahweh. They didn't worship the way the Jews did. But they had a very negative influence on all the population. And as a result, many of the villages, they went astray. And they no longer followed the Lord. So into that village, in Bethlehem, comes this old ancient prophet by the name of Samuel. David, he wasn't in town the day that Samuel came in. He was back in the field working. He was keeping his dad's sheep. His day was no different than any other day. There was no voice from heaven like the angel that was going to announce in many years later to those shepherds that a Messiah was coming. All he did that morning was lead his flock, bind up a broken leg probably, stand watch, heal a sick one, and he made a little music on his harp. He didn't know that the prophet was in town. He didn't also know that by the end of the day, his life would never be the same again. He would be pointed to the throne of Israel, and he had no idea that that was coming that morning when he went to work. Do you think there's something exciting coming for you? Not from a psychic, or from a fortune teller, or from some horoscope. It's coming from God. You're God's children. Do you think that he has you in mind for something special? It might not happen today. It might not happen tomorrow, and may not even happen next month. Nobody knows when. But when you travel by faith, the Lord won't lead you astray. All your job is is to just simply be still and obey. Samuel the prophet, he's standing before all the people in the village. In 1 Samuel 16:5, he says, "In peace I have come. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. I want you to consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." In the crowd, he saw Jesse and his sons. And he had invited them to the sacrifice. So in a field just outside the town of Bethlehem, there they all gathered, the whole town, to worship, led by this old prophet named Samuel. An altar was prepared, fire was lit, the heifer was sacrificed, prayers were offered, and the crowd departed. As Jesse was leaving, Samuel said to him, "Jesse, I'm going to join you at home on the farm. I'm coming home with you." Jesse said, "That's fine. Come. I got a matter I want to discuss with you and your family." "Fine." Samuel's going to choose one of his sons by the end of the day to be the anointed one. He hasn't been told which one it is. As all the sons of Jesse were paraded before him, I'm sure Jesse thought, "What's this old man doing? Why is he so inquisitive over all my sons?" Samuel watched carefully. First, Eliab, the oldest boy, he came by. Then Abinadab, he came by. And then Shammah, he came by. Samuel, seeing all these fine young men, every one was handsome, every one was worldly wise. Under his breath, he whispered to God, "Which one do you want? They're all good. How can I pick them?" God said, "Keep looking. Just keep looking." In the midst of the parade of possibilities, God says to Samuel in 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, "Don't look at his appearance. And I don't want you looking at the height of his stature, because I've rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, his face and his good looks, but the Lord, he looks at the heart." Do you remember what God said way back in chapter 13? "I'm looking for a man after my own heart." When God makes choices, he has his reasons. Just like he does when he picked you out. God has his reasons for picking you. Did you catch the phrase that God spoke to Samuel? Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks right through to the heart and the soul. Samuel watched Eliab, he watched Abinadab, he watched Shammah, he watched all the other sons, and they paraded by. They weren't the ones. They weren't going to be chosen as king. Don't you find that strange? His youngest son, David, he wasn't even at home. When the prophet arrived, everybody was there, not David. Do you wonder if Jesse the dad had equal appreciation for all his kids? Do you think he felt that the youngest was only a sheep herder and nothing more? He won't make anything more of his life. Do you treat your children equally? When God chose you, aren't you glad that he didn't compare you to somebody else? God chooses beyond your age. He chooses beyond your size. God chooses beyond your sex. He chooses beyond your intelligence. All that moment, when all the sons of Jesse had been looked over, God spoke to Samuel and said, "It's now that I want you to do your job." I'd like to have been there the moment when that messenger appeared, coming over the fields where David was keeping watch over his sheep. He's yelling David's name. "David, where are you?" David sees him, puts down his staff, leaves his little lamb that he's been holding in his hand, And he yells back, "Here I am." The messenger, he walks over and he says to David, "David, you're wanted back at the house. A special guest has arrived. I'm staying to look after your sheep in your place. You can leave now. They're waiting for you back home." David has never had that happen before. He's never been interrupted in the middle of a day. So back home he goes. I wonder what went through his head as he made his trek through the pasture. Did something happen to Dad and Mom? He was mystified. His steps rather quickened. When he came into the door of the house, all his family was there staring at him. But there was somebody that he'd never seen before, Samuel the prophet. He wore a long robe. He appeared very distinguished, with his long white hair and matching beard. Samuel looked at him, and suddenly a voice within him said, "This is your man. He's the one that I have chosen." David stood before them. He had no understanding of what had gone on before. He didn't know that his brothers had gone all the way through, one by one, paraded in front of Samuel, but they weren't the one. He didn't know that his brothers had all been interrogated, but they weren't picked. He probably felt like a pork chop at a bar mitzvah, a total misfit. What am I doing here? Why are they all staring at me? What's this old man doing? I'll let the Bible tell you what happened. 1 Samuel 16, verse 12. Jesse sent and brought David to the house. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Arise, anoint him, for this is the one that the Lord has chosen." Then Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the midst of his brothers. Picture it. David's a teenager. He comes into the family setting in his own house, but it's full of people and a stranger, an old man. He can hardly walk. He approaches David, and he proceeds to pour oil over his head, and it flows down over his face and down onto the floor. And while it's happening, the old man, with an ever tender smile, he whispers in David's ear, "You're going to be the next king of Israel." What does David do? With his hair still caked in oil, he goes back to his sheep. He leaves his family, leaves the house. He's going to be the next king. Before that can take place, he's got some business to attend. His sheep. He's got to care for them. He did it before, he's going to do it now. He can't leave them. It's his responsibility, isn't it? Are you aware that God's selections are always sovereign? It doesn't matter if you're choosing your mate. It doesn't matter if you're choosing your career. It doesn't matter if you're choosing where to live. You're choosing a church to worship, have children. You're going to have surgery. We all make kinds of selections every day. But it's easy, very easy, to overlook God's selections and take matters into our own hands. God is still in the business of saying, "You're mine. I'm going to use you. You have shown me that you're faithful. You've been faithful in your education. You've been faithful in your marriage. You've been faithful on your job." Pretend it's the year 1020 BC. You're living in Israel in Judea, the hill country of Bethlehem. Everything in the country is falling apart. A man named King Saul has led the country astray. Fierce enemies are about to take an attack. The focal point of all the Jewish settlers is nothing but fear. God speaks to his prophet Samuel and says, "Help is on the way. I'm making a selection. He'll be a man after my own heart. And you'll find him in the hill country, the Judean highlands. He's only a teenager. but he's what I want. He's right now in the little hamlet of Bethlehem. His name is David. No one's ever noticed him before, but I have. God says, I want you to anoint him. Watch what I'm going to do with him. Well, over the next number of weeks, as we study the life of David, we're going to watch what God is going to do with that young man's life. And I'm going to watch what it's going to do with your life when you come and sit in with me too. Help is on the way, says the Lord. And I'm making a selection. And that selection's going to be you. Come and find out what you're to do. I'll see you next week.